This interview is being conducted for the Marmite Housing, a People's History project. My name is Rachel Kelly and the respondent is David Allan. This is the 29th of August 2025 and the interview is taking place at the Marie Trust in Glasgow. Thanks very much for agreeing to do this interview,
It's a pleasure.
For the record, would you please confirm your name?
My name is David Allan.
And what year, just the year, were you born, please?
1958.
And where were you born?
I was born in Ayrshire, in the west of Scotland.
Can you be more specific?
In a green field of Ayrshire in the west of Scotland.
And why was that?
Well, my mum decided that, my sister who was older than me was very late when she was born, and my mum thought this was going to happen again. She said she absolutely felt fine. So they went out somewhere, I can't remember where, my mum and dad, and they were coming across a field and she went into labour and she sort of like didn't really bother. But then things just progressed and I popped out right on time, bang on time. But was very sickly, so my mum always blamed me. It was my fault for coming early, sort of stuff. Anyway, but my dad was a fireman, so he knew what to do and everything.
So they stopped the train and put you in
so
the field?
They stopped the train, put me in everything. But he knew what to do and everything because he was a fireman. So it wasn't like there was a massive panic attack. It was just, and it was all sort of just brushed over. It was never something particularly exciting. Because again, it was the countryside, so home births and things like that happened all the time, sort of thing. And like my gran had like 11 kids and stuff like that. So my mum was used to births and kids and all that sort of stuff happening, those sort of things going on. It was just an inconvenience, I think, rather than anything else.
Okay, so where do you live now?
I live in Glasgow. I live in the city centre in Charing Cross, just beside the M8, which is good. If I look sideways out the window, I can see the cars going past the M8.
So could you grew up in a post-war house?
Yes, we grew up, originally I lived in the cottage, which was just 2 rooms and a scullery sort of that had been attached onto the back with a sort of half outside toilet. It used to be outside, but my dad built this sort of porch so the toilet was inside. And then we moved into a council house that had actually been built just before the war. When they closed down all the miners' rows, they closed down all the small pits in Ayrshire. So the pit owners and the council built this, what they called the village, but it was just 2 rows of houses really, in a field in the middle of nowhere. And we moved into there, and they were like 4 in a block, sort of big 4 in a block. So we went from these 2 rooms, living in these 2 rooms, to a 3-bedroomed upstairs house, which was very odd, with a massive garden and stuff like that. And that was the council house, so we stayed there. And then we moved from there into a 1970s house, a very 1970s house, the very typical 1970s house, which was up and downstairs and had a back and front garden. And my dad lived there for 60 years, till he died, sort of stuff. It was all very strange. And that was very strange because when they lived there, when we moved there, again, there was just fields all round about. And now there's like a main road at the bottom of the garden and all these houses and stuff like that. And then I moved to Glasgow and lived in various different places over the years.
So whereabouts in Ayrshire was that?
The house was in a small place called Girdle Toll, which is just outside Irvine. That's the nearest place to it, sort of stuff. And at that time, although it's very near now, it's a very big place now because a lot of what was called the Glasgow overspill people went to Irvine. Irvine became a new town. It was the only old new town in Scotland. All the other new towns were created from nothing, but Irvine was a new town. So I think the population of Irvine went up tenfold in something like 10 years. A lot of people came from Anderston, around the Anderston area when they cleared Anderston, down to Irvine when they built Buttery Hill, this big massive estate called Buttery Hill, and that sort of edged onto the edge of our village, So now where my dad lived, instead of being in the countryside, is actually right in the centre of a massive, massive housing estate. It just looks like it looks very strange because it's these 1930s foreigner blocks in the middle of what are all these much newer houses. So it looks very old. And for a while nobody wanted to live in them because of their old houses. And of course now everybody wants to live in them because they've got lovely big rooms and they've got big gardens and stuff and things like that.
So when was that Irvine became a new town?
Oh, I was at high school when that happened. So it must have been the very early 70s sort of stuff, and they demolished all what was some lovely, as they did in the 70s, they basically demolished the middle of Irvine and these lovely buildings and built this 1970s shopping mall across the river. They demolished the bridge across the river and everything and built this awful shopping mall and stuff and things like that. And it did change the whole area, it changed the whole of Ayrshire really a lot, because all these people were just arriving. These people were coming from Glasgow who came for an opportunity to get a house, but also there was lots of employment. They opened lots of factories, mainly I think things like electronic work, electronic work, but you know what I mean. Stuff like that, and lots of people came down, and people came because you could get a house, which people thought was unimaginable. One of my friends, one of the women I know who I'm friendly with, her and her husband moved from Springburn, and she lived in a flat in Springburn with her mum and dad, her 4 sisters and her gran, and she moved to a back and front door up and downstairs house with her husband, and she went and saw the house, and then the next day she took her sisters down to see it, and her sisters wouldn't believe that people didn't live upstairs. They kept saying to her, no, you'll just have the downstairs, there'll be somebody else living upstairs, especially because there was also a toilet down the stairs, which was having a toilet, but there was a bathroom upstairs but a single toilet downstairs. And she said, no, this will be your toilet, Gina, upstairs there'll be somebody else come and move, and they just would not believe that she could have all this space, so it was amazing. So that's what attracted lots of people to come there, was basically a house rather than anything, getting the house. But my mum and dad really liked their house, their 1970s house, especially because it had a nice garden which got the sun all day, and my mum just sat in it all day. And of course it was big and it had all these 1970 things in it. It had central heating, which was rare because nobody in the village has central heating. And I remember coming home from school one day and all my mum's pals were sitting around the radiators in the living room looking at it and commenting how wonderful it was to have this heating, and saying to my mum, oh, it's wonderful, and touching it, oh, it's wonderful, Isa, it's great, look. And my mum very proudly standing, with a tea towel saying, look, you can dry your washing on it, look, you can do this with it. And Ray and Betty and all them sitting there with a cigarette and a wee glass or something and saying, oh, it's great, Isa. So it just comes on, you just put, oh, it's fabulous, because it was so bizarre having this central heating and having all this space and stuff and things. It was just unreal.
So do you have any particular memories of the Glaswegians coming to Ayrshire as such? Was it an event?
It was interesting. I would say that a lot of the populace weren't very keen on it, sort of thing, because it was because it was such a dramatic change very quickly. There was also the fact that it was because they were building all these new houses, it was like they were very separate. It wasn't like they were integrating into the town, if you know what I mean. It wasn't like they were coming in and doing things. It was like it was a separate entity, and it was over there. And of course, as soon as all these people came, all these stories started going out about what was happening in these estates. That everybody was wife swapping apparently, and they were having sex key parties, which I thought was very strange. I remember as a kid thinking, a sex key party? What do you do at a sex key party? And there was all this stuff going on, and it was very much, it was like a total it was like a separate tribe had arrived, very much, sort of stuff. Because they built new schools, and the Glasgow people only went to those schools, so they didn't come to the schools in the town, sort of stuff. They stayed over that side. And I remember one of my aunties moved to the new estate, and my gran cried. My gran came round and cried at my mum's because she couldn't understand why my auntie wanted to move over there. What did she want to move over there for? I remember that day my gran coming to the house and crying because my auntie had dared to move from the village and move to this new estate. It was just like, what's she doing? So that it was very separate. They were very separate. And I suppose in some ways, I didn't hear this, but maybe thinking about it, maybe for the people who wanted to retain things as they were, certainly in the town, when all the centre was demolished and stuff, that maybe these people were blamed for that. They were blamed. It's their fault that we had to knock down all our lovely buildings and build this horrible shopping mall that we didn't want. Nobody wanted. It was perfectly fine, as it was, sort of thing.
Am I right in saying that you used to go up to Glasgow when you were young?
Yes, I would go up to Glasgow quite a lot. As a child, none of my aunties or uncles had any kids, so we were sort of like talking kids, and we would get dressed up and taken with them whenever they wanted to go to a kid. One of my aunties loved going to the cinema in Glasgow, and she would go and see The Sound of Music every week. So one of us would be trailed along to see The Sound of Music, which after a while you didn't want to do, but you knew then that you could work out, you could get a Knickerbocker glory, if you went to Sound of Music. Also, my auntie and uncle used to take me to the Citizens Theatre, to the Panto, and I first went there in 1968. And beside the Citizens Theatre was like a tobacconist shop, and everybody smoked then. My uncle smoked, my auntie didn't. So my uncle would go in to get like a packet of Embassy cigarettes, and I was allowed to pick either a box of the wee green boxes of Roundtree pastels or Roundtree fruit crumbs, and I was allowed to get one, or you would get this sort of like very flat box of chocolates that just had one layer of chocolates in them. So we would coming to Glasgow was quite good. And Auntie Mary, if she was doing shopping, buying something to wear, going to a wedding or something, you had to go to Glasgow with Auntie Mary, forget her to pick her hat, maybe, or something. And also, if you needed something, excuse me, if you needed something for an event, one of the aunties would take you to Glasgow to get you kitted out and stuff. So Glasgow was somewhere we came along. I remember as a child coming back from Glasgow with my mum and dad, and they had a massive like standard lampshade, which caused great hilarity on the train. I just have this vision of that. But I also remember coming to Glasgow in the train and going through Paisley and seeing, people living in tenements with smashed windows and stuff. I have this very vivid memory of going through what would be Paisley at the time and seeing this family eating their lunch or their dinner in this room, and this windows were smashed, and because there was they just had no money. The poverty was just so extreme. And they were living in, it wouldn't be council housing then, it'd be sort of like some sort of factored housing. So Glasgow was somewhere that I was very used to, coming, and somewhere that excited me a lot. I liked Glasgow because there was all these people.
Can we move to when you lived in bedsits? Because I'm aware that in another interview you've talked about the house. So can you tell me about your first bedsit or shared flat that you lived in? My first shared flat in Glasgow was I shared with, the flat had 6 people in it, and that was in Buccleuch Street, just beside the underground, Cowcaddens Underground, and that was sort of that was a new building, it had just been built, and very, very strangely the heating was included in the rent, so we had the heating on all the time, which was bizarre when you think back then. So we used to walk about in t-shirts and shorts, which people didn't do then. Everyone does it now in their house. And people would come up and the heating would just be blasting all the time. So I had my own bedroom, and I had a sink in my bedroom. All the bedrooms had sinks in them, which was good. And my bedroom was sort of like the end of the corridor, and there were 2 bathrooms, and right beside my bedroom was a bathroom. And the other bathroom was down the other end, and somehow I just sort of annexed this bathroom up this end, because people were always moving out and moving in. People moved out and moved in, moved out, and that bathroom just sort of became my bit. So everybody else used the other side. So I had this sort of little flat, but we had a shared living room and a shared kitchen, which of course caused great fun because you had to have rotas and stuff, and people stealing things and not stealing things, and people having fights over bits of cheese, and
people bringing their friends back and having parties and the police coming and things, which was great. The police came one night at like 6 in the morning after a party. It went all night and knocked on the door, and I opened the door, and all the police, there were police right downstairs, and they said, you have to do this, have to do that, and I said I didn't invite you, and shut the door, and they went away. So of course I'd had maybe a little refreshment by that time. So I lived there for about a year and a half, I think, but then it was just all this constant living with different people. And we had this rule for some reason. There was this rule in the flat that you weren't allowed to have a lock on your bedroom door. There was all this thing about trust. And one of the guys did put a lock in his bedroom door, and he was made to take it off. And that wasn't like the landlord that made him do it. It was sort of like a house rule for some reason, that we all sort of like lived together in this lovely commune and supported one another, which of course nobody did. Well, I did, but nobody else did. So I moved so I got kind of fed up with living there, and then my friend Audrey had somewhere and she needed a flatmate, so I moved in with her into this flat in Ely Street, just off Byers Road.
What number?
Number 11 Ely Street, and we were on the top. The flat, it was basically a 1-bedroom tenement flat with a big kitchen sort of stuff. So Audrey had the living room, and I had what was the bedroom, and we shared the rest of the space, and that was great, but it was freezing. It was absolutely freezing. I mean, there was she had a gas fire in her room which didn't really work, and I had a little gas fire with a miser control that actually has a miser thing on it. You turn it right down, it said miser on it, and there was there was another miser control fire in the kitchen, and of course these were these massive rooms, and of course it did nothing, no single pane glass, so these big windows. So I would be lying in my bed in the winter, and Audrey would be in her bed in the living room, and she would shout through, "Go and put the fire on in the kitchen." And I'd say, "It's your turn, it's your turn. It's your turn, it's so cold. No, I can't get up. You've got to get up for your work. Put the fire on, put the fire on." And I remember once going into the bathroom, and Audrey was sitting in the bath, hair drying herself because she was so cold, because she was blue from here up, washing with one hand and hair drying herself with the other, because it was so cold. It was so utterly cold. And all the furniture came either from the Barras. We carried it from the bar. We used to go to the Barras every Saturday or Sunday, and we'd buy something like a chair or a chest of drawers or something, and just carry it home via the chip shop. We'd stop off in the chip shop with our chair or chest of drawers and have chips, fish and chips, or a bookcase or something, or a wee table, and then we'd just carry it all the way home to Byers Road, probably via a pub as well. Or it came from Skips or the street, because you used to find great things in Skips. I once found a fabulous single wardrobe and things, and I found a Skip once with like 6 dining chairs in it and all these chips, other stuff, and I ran up the road to say, "Somebody come and stand by this Skip so we can get the stuff out of it." And people would give you things, There's things like, I had a pair of curtains that I had for years that had belonged to one of my aunties, and it moved flats with me all the time. And I had my own bed, which people thought made me posh, because I had my own single bed. I'd bought this single bed, and I used to cart it around all the flats that I lived in. And I would arrive with my single bed, and I would refuse to sleep in the bed that was there, which people, if it was a shared flat, people would say, "Oh, I'll have that bed, it's better than mine." So whenever you lived in shared flats, if somebody moved out, all the furniture would move round, because the person, you would get the better stuff, until you were there the longest and you had all the good stuff. So the person who moved into the empty room all had the rubbish stuff. So Audrey and I lived together in Ely Street for, I think, about a year and a half, round about that. And we had a great time. We both got dumped by our partners that winter, and we spent the whole winter smoking and crying and listening to Lloyd Cole, the whole time, and drinking cheap red wine and making vegetable stew, because we decided to be vegetarians, so we were basically smoking, drinking, crying and farting the whole winter sort of stuff, and that's all we did with the gas fire on. And that's basically what we did that winter, and that was our life. And then I discovered Jesus and the Mary Chain. I discovered them, like, when I say I discovered them, they hadn't been heard of before. And I found this little pop group from East Kilbride, and I was telling them, I found this pop group. And they'd made this promotion record, and we had people up to listen to this, and people were saying, this is just hellish noise. What is this? And I'm saying, just wait. So we lived there for about a year and a half, but then Audrey's partner, who had dumped her, came back, and it was all getting a bit difficult and stuff. So,
sorry, could you tell me about George, just a wee bit about George the cat?
George the cat, the little orange cat. So I had George the cat, and who's very confused, because Audrey used to call him something else, but I can't remember what it was she called him. So when he was in my room, he was called George, and when he went into Audrey's room, he was called something else. It depends. So people used to think we had two cats, but it was only the one cat. So I basically looked after George. I love George. And George was tiny, and George went everywhere. I've got pictures of like George sitting in the bath and things. And he never really grew, he was always very small. And he would go out and he would sit on the window ledge outside the window, and then he would one day, and he would sort of jump to the next window, and then one day sort of jumped to the next door window, and then the next door window, and then got stuck, and one of the neighbours phoned the fire brigade, and I came home from my work, and the ladder was up rescuing George, and people were saying, oh, is that your cat, David? I said, it's not my cat, and I do nothing about it. But you would have to let George out, and he would go down all the stairs, and he would sleep on the street, and he would sleep on the cars. And one day he was sleeping on the roof rack of a car, and the car drove away, and we never saw George again. So George went away to live somewhere else happily, we hope. And that was George the cat, sort of stuff.
So you said that you moved out.
I moved out. I had some friends who shared. Was it for? I can't. No, that's what it was. No, I worked with somebody, and their partner lived in a shared house in Partick in Hayburn Crescent, and that was like that was like a main door basement flat which had 5 bedrooms and a big living room and a shared kitchen. So there was 5. So they were looking for someone to move in there, and I needed to move out of the situation because it was getting very fraught with Audrey and our ex-partner and stuff. And so I moved in there, and like I was saying, when somebody new moved in, they got all the rubbish things. So I got the rubbish room, which was tiny. I mean, tiny. It was smaller than this room, and it had my single bed in it. It had a dining chair and a tiny little chest of drawers, and that's all. You couldn't get anything else in it. And my wardrobe had to be in the hall. So in the hall outside, so if I would get up in the morning, I had to get things in and out the wardrobe from there. So I had the tiny little room, and I was sharing with all these women from Northern Ireland, who'd all known one another in Northern Ireland, and basically didn't wash very much and things and stuff. It was all very strange, and sort of thing. So and then this guy as well and they were doing linguistics and stuff at the university, and all doing their PhDs and stuff, and it was me dotting about with them, and they used to we had to do this whole thing where we had to make up something like 12,000 new words. We just had to make them up, and I used to sit and make up all these words for this person's PhD or something. So we lived there, and that was interesting, because that was the first situation I would say I lived in where there were people who didn't get on. In the past there'd maybe been disagreements and stuff, but there were people who actually actively didn't get on, and that was strange living in that situation, where you were coming home to a fraught situation. And we had this shared living room, and I had again acquired some furniture, and there was a couple of people didn't like my furniture, so I would go to work and I'd come back and I'd find my furniture in the hall and then have to put it back again, and there'd be this tug and fro of this furniture and stuff. And we shared the kitchen, And of course there was always, you know, anywhere you go in any group like that, you know, there's people who do all their bit, there was always one lazy bitch. There's always one person who pretends they've done it. You would come home and they would have left the vacuum cleaner in the middle of the floor to indicate they have vacuumed, but they hadn't actually. You know, they would say they had done things and they hadn't. They wouldn't buy things, they wouldn't buy soap powder and use all yours, and they wouldn't buy soap and they wouldn't buy shower things and stuff like that. They wouldn't buy toilet rolls. There was one person who used to say, why do I need to buy soap? You buy it. You know, what's the point of having 2 bits of soap? You know, sort of thing. So that was very strange. And of course that was sort of a private landlord thing. It was a couple who owned the house and she had got a job with a tied flat to it. But then they were having domestic problems and both of them individually used to come up and moan to us about the other one. And we would have to sit there because they were their landlords, because you had no rights. You had no rights at all then. The landlord. And the toilet kept, you know, like the toilet system kept overflowing because the ball cock wasn't right. And in the cupboard, one of the cupboards downstairs, I had found a gun, like a real gun, you know, that somebody had hidden under the stairs. And it was this real gun. And I used to take it out at parties and shoot people with it, pretend to shoot people. I remember one of my friends, she had all these German friends, and we had this competition to see who could shoot the most Germans with this gun. Anyway, this ball cock, and we kept wanting to get it fixed, and the landlord wouldn't get it fixed. So I tied the gun round the ball cock because it weighed it down, sort of stuff, and then it worked. But then the landlord sent the plumber, and he opened it and found the gun. And of course, the house is full of women from Belfast. You know, and Kate's standing there with this plumber saying, oh, I don't know how that got there, son. That's nothing to do with me. I don't know. No, I don't know anything about that at all. You know, sort of thing. It didn't help that one of the women's, I think, mothers was something. Anyway, but so all these sorts of things happened because you had to make do in men to an extent, sort of stuff. And we got burgled when we were there, which was very strange because the police came and went into somebody's bedroom and said, oh, this is a right mess. And I said, they went in here. It's just always like this. You know, that sort of stuff. You know, so that was really good. That was a nice house. I liked living there.
What did you say what the name of the street was for that?
It was the Hayburn Crescent. And then when we left, actually, the people sold it. Actually, what happened again was people moved out, so you moved up the hierarchy until it became my house. I was the last person, so I was allowed to choose. It was up to me to find. I was the person who was the named person who was renting it, and you got to find the other people, and technically they paid you the rent and you paid it over to the landlord, so you were responsible for it. So it became my house because everybody else moved out, and I moved into a nicer bedroom, a nice big bedroom sort of stuff, which is a fabulous pink rosy carpet, and I loved that. You know, so I really liked that bedroom, and it backed onto the railway line, the Partick railway line, which was really good. And one of my flatmates, she used to grow, dope in the windowsill that backed onto the railway line, and the workmen used to come and shout up at the window, you know, can we buy some leaves off you? I was so embarrassed about this, and I've never told anybody this, but when she went away, I used to take it off the window ledge and then put it back before she came back, and of course it would die in the interim, and I was like, I've got nothing to do with me, don't know anything about it. And one day she was drying all her dope or something, and I just thought it was rubbish and threw it in the bin, and it all had to be retrieved. You know, sort of stuff from the bin. And these are the people that, because you just had to find people to live with. You couldn't be that picky. If somebody knew somebody, we had an empty room and somebody would say, oh, I know a woman from work, or I know a cousin, or I know something like that. And these people would just appear. So you didn't have a big choice of who it was. You had some choice, but you didn't have a big choice, you know, of who ended up in the house, you know, sort of thing. So.
Would you say you're pleased you've had that experience or not?
Yeah, sorry?
Would you say that you're pleased that you've had that experience?
Oh, it's really good because you get to meet lots of people. You get to meet, and of course they all bring their friends, which you then usually have to ban You can say, well, you can have your friends, but they have to stay in your room. They're not allowed in the common rooms. They're not allowed in the living room because they're smelly or they're awful or they're obnoxious. So it was really good. It was really interesting. Actually, during the time I was there, I was offered a flat by Partick Housing Association, and that was at, I think it was Partick Housing Association. That was at Kelvin Bridge, just beside Kelvin Bridge Underground. I don't know what street that is. It's the one like down beside the car park. And it was these like very old room and kitchens. And they were due to do them up, but at that time they were still very run down and derelict. And I said, I'm not living there. I'm not living in that horrible derelict house. And they said, but we'll be doing them all up. We're doing them all up. I said, I'm not living there. And I refused it. And people couldn't believe that I had refused a housing association flat, just because when you're young you just think things are going to work their way out. So we lived there for a while, as I say, with people moving out and sharing and things. But then the couple who owned it finally split up, so they were going to sell it. So we had to move out. But as people, I was still there, as people moved out, because they were moving us out, I just said to them, I says, well, I'm not paying full rent. I'll just pay for the people who are here. And they just said yes. So in the end, I was there by myself and paying very little for this big flat. And eventually I had to move out. And they sold it, and it was split into two houses. So, it's two flats, downstairs. And I moved again into a rented flat with one of my friends, one of my very good friends, for 6 months, and it was a total disaster, because it's that sort of thing where you know your friends until you go on holiday with them, and you know your friends until you have to live with them, and that was a total disaster. And we lived out in Annisland in Dorchester Avenue, and we lived there for just 6 months, and then I moved to Queen's Park, into there, and then after that I got my own flat with Tollcross Housing Association, sort of stuff, and that was very strange, suddenly having your own flat. And that was lovely, it was great, but then it had horrible neighbours, dreadful, terrible neighbours from there. So then I had to move again, and I was in Denniston, and now I'm in Charing Cross.
So how did you, just quickly, how did you find living in housing association flats, and as opposed to living in privately rented flats?
Oh, it's so, I really, really like being with a housing association, because one, they sort of deal with all the practical things. Because I always found having to deal with practical things, like say plumbers and stuff like that, just a nuisance. And now you just phone them up and they just do it, or they just sort it out. And even if they don't sort it out, it's supposed to be their responsibility. You're not responsible. So I think I quite like that. I quite like the safety of it. There's also the fact that I have a secure tenancy, whereas before it was always in the back of your mind that you would be moving because it was a transient thing, and you would have to find somewhere else, and that was always difficult, and where would you end up and how much would it cost, and you would go and look at flats and it'd just be absolutely horrible, but people would live in them and people would want lots of money for them, and you would then maybe have to find somebody else to live with, and it would be whoever was available, so a housing association is great, I think, because they have the responsibility, and then even if they don't do it, you can pull them up about it and say, this is your responsibility, can you fix this please, sort of stuff. There's also the fact that with a housing association, if you then need to move, to say sheltered accommodation or something, they will help you do that. And the housing associations talk to one another, so you can move between the housing associations, which is what I did. So you could move to a different housing association very much. So yes, it's so much better than living just in a rented flat. And I don't know how people nowadays cope with living in rented flats, particularly with the financial implications of that, and also the fact that it seems to be a lot of the rented flats are sort of rented through sort of agencies now. It's not an actual landlord, whereas back in my day it was a landlord, it was a person, you know, who you saw, you know, to do that.
Okay, David, that is all my questions. Have I missed anything?
No, I don't think so. It's interesting. I think it's interesting how much, how social housing has changed over the years. And of course now, because of the issues around homelessness and stuff, it's obviously going to change more. My housing association, Glasgow City Council, have apparently told housing associations that they want them to take up to 70% of people from the homeless list for their allocations if they want any funding for any more, you know, developments. My housing association has a new development where they're converting some flats in the city centre, or converting a building into flats in the city centre, and Glasgow City Council said we'll only give you a grant if you take 70% of the people from the homeless list, which is fine, but obviously that changes the responsibility, and it changes, you know, who is in charge, and it changes who people want to live. All these issues come up about, do people want to live with somebody who they don't know and things and stuff like that. So it's all these different things. But yes, I would advocate the housing association movement, which started in Glasgow really, has been one of the best things, I think, for housing in Scotland.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.